Greetings, everyone. This is Professor Mark Kenoyer, and I'm giving this lecture from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I would like to first thank the Vice Chancellor, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, and also the conference organizers for inviting me to be a keynote speaker at this very important conference. I'm sorry I can't be there in person because I'm teaching my classes in the summer here in Madison, and the timing just doesn't work out for me to be there. But I thought I would record the lecture, and then if you have any questions, you're welcome to send me some emails afterwards. The topic of my talk is going to be 100 years of Indus archaeology, major discoveries, new perspectives, and future directions. And then before beginning the actual lecture, I'd especially like to thank the Department of Archaeology and Museums, Government of Pakistan, and also the Archaeological Survey of India, the Ministry of Heritage and Culture, Oman, and the Office of the Advisor to His Majesty the Sultan for Cultural Affairs. Also thanks to the team of the Harappa Archaeological Research Project, who I've been working with for many years at the site of Harappa, and also for numerous colleagues in Pakistan and in India, and many students for sharing their data and knowledge. And the funding for my work on the Indus has been from many different sources, and I would like to acknowledge them here as well. So the past 100 years have shown a major change in our understanding of the Indus civilization. When it was first discovered in the 1930s, people thought it was derived from Mesopotamia, the idea of civilization coming from the west and into this region. We know now that that is not the case. In fact, the Indus Valley civilization emerged indigenously as a result of local forces and had nothing to do with people from outside coming in and helping this area develop. And I'll be covering some of the major points as I go through my talk. The Indus civilization was contemporaneous with Mesopotamia and also with Egypt and in Oman and in China, early developments of civilization, and all of these areas were connected through trade networks. But indigenous developments were what stimulated the emergence of urban centers in the Indus, and we don't need to look from outside for that impetus. Some of the major questions that still remain to be addressed relate to the mechanism that were used to integrate. How did they integrate? And how did they bring diverse communities and people from different geographical regions into these large urban centers? And also, how did the rural settlements interact with the urban centers? And I'll talk a bit about that in the talk today. The Indus civilization, or the Indus tradition as I call it, is part of a large area of interactions from Oman to Deccan to Ganga to Helmand, Baluchistan, Central Asia. All of these regions interacted with what is happening in the Indus. So the Indus was not isolated even in the region of South Asia, but it was very much linked to surrounding regions. We also know that the Indus integration process was the beginning of a long-term trajectory that eventually saw what we call the Indo-Gangetic tradition, where we have the entire northern subcontinent, including Afghanistan and parts of Central Asia, integrated together into one massive urban society, which happens during the Mauryan period. So this is referred to as the Indo-Gangetic tradition. And I will start my talk with the Indus and then end with the Indo-Gangetic. When in the 1930s people began excavating the Indus civilization, they had no idea of how ancient and how deep the roots were for people living in this region. And we now know that people were living in the Indus more than 2 million years ago in the areas of Riwat near Islamabad, also in Jammu and Kashmir, and we also have it in the Deccan in the southern India. And we have evidence for foraging communities living up until around 10,000 years ago who were very important for interactions in this region. In fact, at Harappa, we have evidence of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers settling in that area before the emergence of the city, so at about 10,000. We also have evidence of early food producing, which is the period of time for the development of agriculture and animal husbandry, and evidence for that is found throughout Baluchistan, and also we have it at Harappa, as well as the areas of the Ganga of India and in the Deccan, And these regions are all combined together to link to this early food producing process. The main new data came in the 1970s from the site of Mehergarh, which was excavated by the French Archaeological Mission in collaboration with the Department of Archaeology. So Mehergarh is in Baluchistan, but it is also one of the most important sites that shows the development of domestic cattle, the humped zebu, and also agriculture relating to wheat and barley and local domestication of cotton and other very important staples. More recently, research in India has shown that sites such as Birana and Girawar, which are located in Haryana, have evidence for early agricultural as well. So on both sides of the Indus Valley, we now have evidence for the development of early settled communities. And at Harappa, we also have evidence for people living there at about the same time. It's not very much, but very little evidence there. The origins of the Indus tradition, we can then say, starts in the Paleolithic, and we can see that the Paleolithic communities extended from Mehergarh all the way to the eastern regions of the Ganga, and scholars who were studying the dental patterns such as Lucas and Walimbe and Pal and Badam in the 70s and 90s argued that there was a group of people which we call Sundadont based on their teeth, which represents a population that was as far as Mehergarh, but also connected also to Southeast Asia. This is an Asian population. These are not people from the Near East moving into South Asia. This pattern has now been confirmed with the study of DNA. So this is a new analysis, and we have been trying to get DNA from the skeletons from Harappa for a long time, but have not been able to extract it. It's there, but it cannot be reconstructed. Fortunately, the site of Rakhigarhi, which is in Haryana, has been able to provide one DNA strand, fragmentary, from one female, and that DNA provides evidence that the populations of South Asia relating to this population of people buried in the cemetery split off from other populations more than 12,000 years ago. So this is the Paleolithic population. Now we need much more DNA data before we can have a much better picture, but this shows that there is a trajectory now that we can confirm. So this is very important new data. The Mehergarh burials also show evidence for long-distance trade. So even though people were local, they were connected. They were connected through trade networks that extended from the Indus region all the way to Iran, to Central Asia, and to the Gulf. So we have lapis lazuli from Badakhshan, we have turquoise from Iran, we have conus shell possibly from the Makran, and also maybe even from Oman. We have clear evidence for local ornament styles relating to bangles, which is a very distinctive South Asian tradition. These were developed from using the shells that are found near Hawke's Bay or Karachi. So this is a local shell, locally produced in a style but worn in Baluchistan. So based on the analysis of shell from Mehergarh and also beads of lapis and turquoise, and also carnelian from Harappa, and also carnelian from Remanderi, we know that people were connected over vast areas. These people were not isolated. There were trade networks linking Gujarat to northern Punjab, to KPK, to Baluchistan, and people were going back and forth between Oman, what is now Oman and UAE, and Makran. So people were highly mobile, but they were also locally based in their regional agro-pastoral communities. This is the foundation for what we will then eventually see is the emergence of cities. So whereas Mehergarh is an important site and it's located at the base of the Bolan Pass, this site never developed into a big city. It was always a village. And now Sharo, which is a small settlement next to Mehergarh, also was a small village. At Harappa, the people who were here at 7,000 or 6,000 clearly had a different trajectory. We have not found that village. It's somewhere underneath the mounds, but people there began developing in local settlement that became connected. So the evidence from Harappa is that people here were linked to the coast, they were linked to Gujarat, they were linked to Central Asia, they were linked to all of these regions through trade networks. And we call this the Hakra Ravi phase. So Hakra was the area along in Cholistan discovered by Dr. Rafiq Mughal, who also proposed the development of this early Harappan tradition. And Ravi is the term that I use at Harappa, but it's also linked to the Hakra. And we have evidence for early writing. We have evidence for the use of the swastika. We have early shell bangles and beads. So we have evidence for a lot of the aspects of hierarchy that were important for developing cities. And Harappa is not isolated. This is one settlement, and surveys by the Punjab Department of Archaeology throughout the entire Punjab found many, many more sites. And one of them is Rajanpur, which was actually found by Muhammad Hassan, who was the previous curator of Harappa Museum. And these surveys, which were actually under the direction of Dr. Mughal, found numerous sites that showed that these settlements like Harappa, which were developed as big cities, were actually surrounded by many smaller settlements. So in the 1930s, they knew of Chak Purbana Sial, which was one site, but now we have many more sites. And you can see that this site, Harappa, is linked to Rajanpur, which is linked to other sites, which are eventually linked to the Potohar, and eventually all the way up into KPK. So this is a very important trade network even today. Studies of the carnelian beads from Harappa show that those beads came from Gujarat. We can identify this using chemicals trace analysis. And the work by Randall Law for his dissertation studied all of the raw materials of stone from Harappa and were able to show that they came primarily from Hazara and Momand and the northern areas of KPK. So people from the north were trading with people in the Punjab, and then some people from the Aravalli in what is now Rajasthan were also trading. There's also evidence for trade from Rodi, which is in Sindh, and then in Gujarat. So Harappa was linked to all of these areas through trade networks. These are all new data that were not available in the early excavators, and demonstrate a totally new perspective of the interaction networks of the Indus. The Kotdiji phase, which is something that was again identified by Dr. Mughal, he argued that the Kotdiji phase is the initial phase of urbanism of the Indus civilization. And this can be dated to around 2800 to 2600 at Harappa. And we see the emergence of seals and writing and weights and evidence for textiles and tika ornaments in the middle of the forehead, the use of gold, and well-developed writing. So we can now say, based on recent work at Harappa, that we have an early writing system during the Ravi phase and then an early Indus script during the Kotdiji phase prior to the development of the big cities. We know that similar developments were going on in other regions, but they had regional variation. So these are the figurines from Baluchistan, from Loralai, from Job, and again, the Kutchi Plain area where the site of Naushado is. They have different styles of headdresses, different turbans, different ornaments. Men wearing bangles, women wearing bangles and ornaments. So they show that there's a high diversity of population, and these people were developing smaller villages and towns all over Pakistan and parts of Western India. The trade networks during the Kotdiji phase, based on Randall Law's research, showed a much wider expanse of networks and much more varied materials coming to Harappa. So this shows that these trade networks were expanding and more people were becoming involved in trans-regional trade. It's during this time period, which we call the regionalization era, that Harappa becomes a fortified settlement. And earlier scholars thought of fortification as an indicator of warfare, but the site of Harappa was actually fortified in two walled settlements that were right next to each other. So they were not being built for warfare. I argue that they were being built for control of economics. A totally different perspective of how early urbanism develops. And I should point out that there's no evidence for major climate change. During this time period, we have two rivers, the Indus, the Gagar, Hakra, Saraswati, and this vast region was well watered by the winter rains and the summer rains, providing an optimal phase of development, but it was not a major climatic fluctuation. We start seeing shared ideology emerging all over this region. So from Brahmanderi, we have horned deity motifs. From Kodiji, the same horn deity motif. From Banawali, which is in Haryana, we have the same motif. So these are areas of Banawali is over here, Damanderi is here, Kodiji is here, and we have it also at Harappa. We have similar cooking traditions emerging with the handi-style cooking pots. And this indicates that people throughout these regions began sharing certain beliefs and also ways of living and eating that became shared. This is very important for setting the foundation for an urban process. They were also linked even further. So we tend to focus on the Indus, but my recent work in Ras Al Had and also in Salut in Oman, we have found a sherd from Salut and also pottery that is similar to what is Kotdijian that may have been made in Oman, but was made in the style of the Kotdijian pottery. These were found by Dr. Mughal at Jalilpur, which is just south of Harappa. So this means that people were already moving across between the Indus and the Gulf, or continued to move. We know that they were moving during the Neolithic period or early food producing era, and now during the regionalization era, also trading. Links between Mohenjo-daro and Harappa are also important because we have now evidence of Kotdijian material from deep excavations in Mohenjo-daro. We knew that from Wheeler's excavations in the 50s, but they didn't really think that this was an important feature. But we know now that Mohenjo-daro has originally a Kotdijian settlement underneath it, and then we see the development of the urban center later. All of this leads to the emergence of big cities, and we have Rakhigarhi, Harappa, Ganweriwala, Mohenjo-daro, and Dholavira. These are the major cities that were developing in the vast Indus region. And this integration phase lasts for 700 years, from 2600 to 1900 BC. I won't have time to go into much detail on all of these things, but basically we now have many different cities, and all of them have similar layouts and similar features, except for Dholavira, which is a bit more complicated. And as I mentioned, there's no evidence that people moved because of climate change or for protection for conflict. And then we need to really understand what led people to live in these big cities. And one of the arguments that I propose is that they had facilities here and safety, which was something that you could not get outside of a city. So the walls were there to protect people from bandits, from dacoits, but also to allow them to have a safe place for their business and to make a living. So these were important features that provided security without necessarily having major warfare. We know that there was a standardization of weights that helped facilitate trade, so every major city had the same weight system. We see the use of at Dholavira of stone instead of mud brick and fired brick, which was the common architectural tradition of the Indus. But we also see here in Dholavira a large signboard that was put above the gateway. So this is the gateway leading into the upper area of the site. Most of the settlements had wells and drains and bathing areas and latrines, which were all very good convenience and sanitary for allowing people of different communities living next to each other in big urban centers. So these are some of the important features of these cities that allowed people from different groups living next to each other and avoiding conflict. So if everyone has their own water and the sewage is put into a drain so it's not going into somebody else's house, then you have less potential for conflict within an urban settlement. There are evidences for large public buildings, which may have been used for ceremonies, such as the Great Bath in Mohenjo-daro. We also have large buildings that were interpreted as granaries, but we know now that they were not granaries. They were large buildings. They may have been palaces, but they were not granaries. The large water capturing systems were also built in Dholavira. These are rock-cut tanks with wells and almost like baulis, where you have people going down to the water at different levels and able to access water, which is an area, this area of Gujarat has less rainfall than in the Punjab. So who were the rulers of these cities? We have clear evidence of the use of seals with writing, but we cannot read the writing, and we will not be able to read the writing until we have a bilingual text. But we can tell by the seals and by the motifs that these were for elites, people who controlled wealth and power. One of the most important symbols is a unicorn, which is a mythical animal with one horn that was invented by the Indus at around 2600 BC and used as a way for identifying one of the important communities that was important for administration. And I argue that they were probably the most common ones were probably officials or merchants, which were responsible for making sure that the civilization ran smoothly. We can't decipher the Indus writing, and I don't have time to go into great detail on the writing system. It's found on many different materials. It was used for personal identification, for ritual, and for trade, but it may be linked to many different languages, and it's probably used to write more than one language. We have evidence for bureaucracy, multiple sealings on to control trade, and we know that the Indus script, which is written here in a very long inscription, changed over time. Some of the earlier texts are shorter, later texts are longer with new symbols, and the Indus script was used to write another language which was used only in the Gulf area. So in the area of Bahrain and Kuwait, we have evidence of other seals that have Indus script but not in the sequence that is used in the Indus. New directions that people are taking, including myself, relate to since we cannot read the Indus script, trying to figure out ways to interpret the archaeological material so we better understand how the cities were organized. And one of the recent directions is how to identify integration and diversity within urban centers. And one way is through the physical structure and how the layout is. So Dholavira is clearly a hierarchical settlement with a castle and a middle town and an outer wall. This is called a Tripura, or three-walled city. It was built for defense against dacoits, probably in the Ran of Kutch. Mohenjo-daro was built very differently. So it has much more complicated neighborhoods, large buildings with multiple smaller houses. So very different structure inside. Most Indus cities look like Mohenjo-daro. We also know that there were shared material culture. So similar types of pottery, handis, seals, figurines are found in most regions of the Indus. Gujarat, however, has very few figurines. So this use of figurines is not common in the Gujarat region. Jewelry and elites are identified by very high value commodities such as jewelry of gold and silver and these carnelian beads. And we have elaborate ornamentation that was used by some of the elite communities. We also have evidence for trade with Mesopotamia and with Central Asia and with Oman, which was linked to the Indus through the marine networks as well as overland trade. We have evidence of Central Asian seals being found in Indus cities and sealings on clay in Mohenjo-daro, which indicates a merchant from Central Asia came to Mohenjo-daro, stamped this clay, and an Indus merchant stamped it as well, and then they fired it. So this indicates bilateral trade between these regions. Another indicator of integration is seen in similarities of food. So the types of animals that were domesticated, the types of animals that were eaten, were all shared across this vast region. The chicken was also domesticated. It's one of the earliest evidences for domestic chicken in the world. And this is a spur from Harappa and figurines from Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. Fishing was also very important, both riverine and marine fish. We have also evidence for spices, which are found on the calculus of cattle teeth. We know that cattle like to eat the garbage that people throw out in the street, as do the monkeys. But we've analyzed some calculus of the teeth from Harappa, and this was done by Arunima Kashyap, one of the students of Stephen Weber, and she found evidence for turmeric. So the use of turmeric goes back to the Indus period. And turmeric is not grown traditionally in the Punjab. It probably came from central or southern India, or maybe eastern India, as a root plant. We also have now evidence for mango and banana and some kind of sweet cane, not the modern sugar cane, but an ancient sweet cane that would have been grown along the rivers, and jamun probably, and also various other fruits such as lasura and ber and apples and oranges, and limes. These are things which are all indigenous to South Asia. So Indus food and cooking traditions were an important part of how the cities were integrated. And they would also help to differentiate people. So diversity reflects the array of social classes and ethnic groups who lived in the cities. And if you have the ability to get expensive spices and you have a special feast and invite people there, then this is a way to reinforce your status and power. So diversity and hierarchies of food in the cities would have been an important way to reinforce social differences, as well as to unify communities through feasts and ritual sacrifices. The handi is one of my favorite cooking vessels or pottery that I like to talk about, because this is very distinctively an Indus feature, starting from the Ravi phase all the way to the late Harappan. And we now have evidence for handis in Oman. And some of the handis were brought from the Indus, but some of them were made in Oman, which means the potters from the Indus Valley came to Oman and were making them in the interior. And that means that people who liked the food cooked in a handi were also living in this region, whether they were local Omanis, Arabians, or whether they people from the Indus and Sindh, we don't really know. But we can see that the pottery that is identified as Indus pottery is very distinctive chemically. And these are pottery made, Indus-style cooking pots made with local clay from Oman. We also have evidence for trade items. So these are large storage vessels traded, and we have them made in Harappa, made in Mohenjo-daro, and also now evidence for them being made in Oman. So this indicates a trade of materials over vast areas. I'm going to end now with just a few discussions of ornaments, because I think that ornaments provide one of the best ways to show diversity, integration, and also hierarchy within the Indus cities. They provide symbols, ornaments provide a symbol of identity and gender, wealth, status, and ethnicity. And we are all familiar with the ornaments of the priest king and the textiles that would have been worn by this individual. We have different styles of bangles, from clay to shell to faience to gold, and then clay vessels and bronze vessels, and wide ranges of artificial materials such as fired steatite and faience. We also know that bangles, which were worn by both men and women, were also used for hierarchy. And some of the women were clearly wearing these and then were buried with them in the grave. But the cemeteries are something that we need to reconsider. Earlier scholars kept looking for the royal cemeteries. There are no royal cemeteries of the Indus civilization. In fact, most people of the Indus were not buried. So we have excavated the cemetery at Harappa. They have not found a cemetery from Mohenjo-daro yet. And a few other sites have cemeteries, but they're very small and they don't represent all the people living in the city. So Harappa would have had a population of 50 to 80,000 people for 700 years. That's a lot of people. And they are not found buried around the site. Only about 250 or 280 people have been estimated for the cemetery at Harappa. So most people would have been cremated, or water burial in the river, or exposure in the jungle. The people who were buried, however, are Harappan. They are one group of elites of the Harappan, and they had pottery and ornaments which are very distinctively Harappan. And we know that the people who were buried at Harappa Cemetery were not all born and raised at Harappa. You can identify this by looking at strontium isotopes in the teeth, and we know that many of the women were local. So this is the women that were local. These are the people born and raised at Harappa and died at Harappa. But all of these other people, both men and women, came to Harappa and married into the local community and then were buried in this cemetery. So it indicates that the elites, and I think that this is one group of elites, were linked over vast distances, maybe from the areas of Sindh to the south, or Gujarat, or Balochistan, and they were interacting over great distances. Potters would marry within 30 kilometers of their house, but elites marry between cities, and this is one way to help us understand how the Indus cities were integrated. So far, we have no evidence for warfare, and many scholars say this is not possible, that you can't have an urban society without warfare, but so far we really don't have any evidence, and this suggests that the mechanisms for ruling related to ideology and economics and not physical coercion. So religion was one of the important features that we were trying to study and better understand. We know that they had worshiping of deities. They had human-headed animal forms. They had ceremonies. They had sacred trees. And many of the symbols of contest that we see between deities and animals are also replicated in later iconography found in the later periods. And this is Durga killing the Mahishasura Mardini. She is killing the water buffalo demon that is disrupting the universe. So this type of sacrifice of water buffaloes and yogic position can clearly be seen starting in the Indus period and continuing on into later times. The Indus concept of yoga also becomes borrowed by later Jain and Buddhist and Hindu traditions, and we see that in some of the Gandhara and Mathura sculptures of the later period. So what happened to the civilization? Why did it disappear? Earlier scholars thought of invasion, but we now know there were no invasions that came in and destroyed the civilization. There were changes in the river system. There were regional fluctuations in climate, but no major climate change. But we do see changes in burial traditions. We see evidence for disappearance of the seals and the lack of writing. The writing stopped being used. So the people who were in control lost control, and the new people who were in power used very different ways of controlling. And this is the transition between the Indus and the later Vedic traditions that we can talk about. So we know that there was a shift in population centers. And from the Punjab, we see movement into the northern Indus to areas of Bannu, Accra, and Charsada, and Peshawar, and then eventually Taxila. We also see movement into the Ganga region, so eventually moving into areas that relate to the Ganga-Yamuna Doab. But we see eventually the emergence of new deities, new coinage system, clear evidence for warfare, and this was warfare using horses and elephants. And we see eventually the emergence of an empire that was integrated by warfare, which we have literary texts for and we have physical evidence for in the archaeology that was used to integrate. And they used horses and camels and elephants, and they also used iron technology. They also developed eventually a new writing system, which is invented in South Asia probably, but maybe derived from other linkages. But this is the Brahmi script that was eventually used for texts for traders, and then eventually used for Buddhist, Jain, and then later into Brahmanical texts. And one last point that I want to make is that new carbon dating of ancient materials, these are materials found in 1881 in the Bakshali village near what is now Peshawar. This is a text, a birch bark text that was found, and then now we can date the ink, and we can say that this dates to the 3rd to 4th century CE. So this shows that new techniques can be used even on old data, and new and improved scientific approaches provide new ways to interpret old data as well as new directions for unraveling the complex history of the region. So I thank you for your time, and I'm sorry if I went over a little bit, but there will not be any time for questions. You can email me your questions at some point. Thank you very much.